You won't believe what happened in that frozen chapel in Wyoming, 1934. Dr. Richard Brennan woke at 3:33 a.m., feeling cold hands cutting into his abdomen. He was alone. The chapel was locked from the inside. No one else for miles. But the hands were real, precise, surgical, impossibly cold. When dawn broke through the shattered stained glass, he looked down at his stomach. Perfect surgical scars, fresh, professional, and the tumor that was killing him. Gone. 6 months to live, they said. But something operated on him that night. Something that left no footprints in the snow outside. My name is John. I've been hunting miracles for 60 years. I've walked through abandoned chapels from Montana to Maine, from forgotten whispers in dusty archives to cold trails that lead nowhere. But some stories find you. It was late October 2019 when I received a leather journal in the mail. No return address, just a Boston postmark and a note. My grandfather never spoke of this. He made me promise to burn it. I can't. Someone needs to know. Inside, the precise handwriting of a surgeon, Dr. Richard Brennan, 1891-1978, renowned, respected, and according to every medical journal I could find, a man who disappeared from public life in 1934 and returned 6 months later. Changed. The journal started normally enough. Patient notes, surgical procedures, medical observations. Then, March 1934, the entries shifted, became frantic, desperate. He'd been diagnosed with an aggressive abdominal tumor, pancreatic, the kind that kills slowly, painfully. 6 months, maybe less, but it wasn't the diagnosis that made him travel 800 miles from Boston to the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. It was rage, pure, intellectual rage. His colleague, Dr. Whitmore, had sent him a letter claiming he'd witnessed miraculous healings at some forgotten chapel called St. Helena. Impossible, Brennan wrote in the margins, underlining it 3 times. Spontaneous remission, misdiagnosis, fraud. So he went to prove it, to expose it, to die doing what he did best, dismantling superstition with cold, hard facts. He packed his medical bag, his camera, his notebooks. He told his wife he was visiting a patient in Denver. He lied to everyone. On March 15, 1934, Dr. Richard Brennan arrived at St. Helena Chapel, a structure so remote, so forgotten, it didn't even appear on most maps. He expected to find charlatans. He found something far worse. The chapel stood like a broken tooth against the Wyoming sky. St. Helena had been abandoned for nearly 30 years when Brennan arrived. The wooden walls, once painted white, had surrendered to grey rot. The bell tower leaned at an angle that defied physics. Shattered stained glass littered the entrance like coloured ice. But it was the silence that struck him first. No birds, no wind through the grass, just absence. His journal entry from that. First day reads clinically, structure approximately 40 x 20 feet. Single room, 12 pews, 7 intact. Altar damaged but standing. No evidence of recent human activity. Temperature inside anomalously cold, 48 degrees, despite exterior reading of 67 degrees. Interesting, but explainable. Always explainable. That was Brennan's religion. He'd interviewed the locals in the nearest town, 15 miles south, a gas station attendant, a general store owner, a rancher who'd lived there 50 years. They all knew the chapel. They all avoided it. Folks got healed there back in the day, the rancher told him, not meeting his eyes. Reverend Calloway had the gift, they said, put his hands on you and the sickness just left. And where is this Reverend Calloway now? Brennan had asked, pen poised over his notebook. Dead. 1904. They found him in the chapel, kneeling at the altar. Been dead 3 days, they figured, but he was still warm. Brennan wrote local folklore, hysteria, probable heat stroke misattributed to supernatural causes. He set up camp in the chapel that first night, sleeping bag on a pew, Medical supplies organized with surgical precision, camera positioned to capture the altar, thermometer, notepad, flashlight. The pain in his abdomen was constant now, a dull, gnawing presence that morphed into sharp agony without warning. He'd packed enough morphine to manage it, enough to keep working, enough to maintain his dignity when the end came. At 11:47 p.m., he documented the temperature drop, 48 degrees to 41 degrees in 15 minutes. Possible structural draft, he wrote, though he'd found no openings beyond the shattered window. At 1:23 a.m., he woke to the smell of incense. Sweet, cloying, impossible. There was no incense in the chapel. He searched every corner with his flashlight. Nothing. At 3:33 a.m., he woke again. The moonlight through the broken window had shifted, casting the shadow of the wooden cross on the opposite wall. And in that shadow, for just a moment, he swore he saw it move. Optical illusion, he muttered, forcing his breathing to steady. Exhaustion, pain medication, but his hands were shaking as he wrote the entry. Day 2 brought frustration. He photographed every inch of the chapel, measured, documented, found nothing that couldn't be explained by decay and abandonment. The cold was unusual, yes, but old buildings held cold. The smell of incense was probably residual oils in the wood. Everything had an explanation. By the third day, the pain was winning. He'd increased his morphine dose twice. The tumor was growing fast now, pressing against organs, stealing his appetite, his strength. He could feel it inside him like a stone fist, clenching tighter. That afternoon, he found the letter. It was wedged between two floorboards near the altar, yellowed with age, the ink faded but readable. Dated October 3rd, 1903, written in an elegant hand. To whoever finds this, I am Reverend Calloway. Tomorrow I will ask God for one final miracle, not for myself. My time is done, but for this place, for those who come after, desperate and dying, seeking what medicine cannot give. I do not know if he will answer. I do not know if I am worthy, but I will kneel here until he does, or until I join him. May those who suffer find what I could not. Peace. Brennan read it 3 times. Then he wrote, obvious fabrication, planted to perpetuate the myth. Paper consistency suggests modern origin despite artificial aging, but he folded the letter carefully and placed it in his journal anyway. That third night, he couldn't sleep. The pain was too intense. He lay on the pew, staring at the broken ceiling, watching stars through the holes in the roof. Orion, the Big Dipper, cold, distant, indifferent. If you're real, he whispered to the darkness, to the God he'd stopped believing in when his mother died screaming of cancer 30 years ago, then why this? Why any of this? The chapel offered no answer. Just cold, just silence, just the slow creak of settling wood. He closed his eyes, waiting for the morphine to dull the edges of agony. He didn't know that in 4 hours everything he believed about reality would shatter like the stained glass beneath his feet. He didn't know that something had been listening and it was preparing to answer. To March 18th, 1934. Brennan's journal entry from that moment is barely legible. The handwriting deteriorates across the page, from his usual precise script into frantic scratches. He woke to pressure. Not pain. He knew pain intimately by now. This was different, external, deliberate, like hands pressing down on his abdomen through his sleeping bag. His eyes snapped open. The chapel was flooded with pale blue light. Not moonlight. The moon had set hours ago. This light seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. It cast no shadows. It made no sound. And he was not alone. I cannot see them, he wrote later, his hand shaking so violently the words barely formed. But I feel them. 4 distinct points of pressure, hands, cold. So impossibly cold they burn. They are real. Dear God, they are real. He tried to move, couldn't. His body was locked in place, not by force, but by an absence of will, like sleep paralysis, but he was fully awake, fully conscious, every nerve screaming alertness, the hands pressed harder. He felt his sleeping bag unzip. He didn't see it move, but he felt the cold air hit his skin as it opened, felt his shirt being lifted, not roughly, carefully, surgically. Then the pressure changed. It moved inside him. "They are cutting me," the journal reads. "No instruments, no blades, but I feel incision. I feel separation of tissue, layer by layer, skin, muscle, fascia. They know exactly where to go. They know what they're looking for." He tried to scream. His jaw wouldn't move, his throat wouldn't work, but his eyes were open, staring at the chapel ceiling, watching the blue light pulse and shift like something alive. The cold penetrated deeper, into his abdomen, into the place where the tumor had been growing, stealing his life one cell at a time. And he felt, God help him, he felt, fingers wrapping around something inside him. "They are removing it," he wrote. "I feel them extracting the mass. There is no pain. There should be pain. I should be dying. I should be screaming, but there is only pressure, only cold, only the absolute certainty that I'm being operated on by something that should not exist." Time became meaningless. Was it minutes? Hours? He had no way to measure. His watch had stopped at 3:33, the hands frozen in place. He became aware of sounds. Not in the chapel, in his head, whispers, not words, not English, not any language he recognized. But somehow, impossibly, he understood their meaning. Broken, corrupted, dying, we repair, we restore, as he asked Calloway, the Reverend, his prayer, his final miracle. Brennan's rational mind, even in that moment of impossibility, tried to catalogue, to explain. Mass hallucination from morphine, fever dream from infection, neurological event from tumor pressure on his brain, but the cold was too real. The pressure too specific, the sensation of being unmade and remade too visceral. Then as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The hands withdrew. The blue light faded. The whispers ceased. He lay there alone in the darkness, his heart hammering so hard he thought his ribs might crack. Slowly, sensation returned to his limbs. His jaw unlocked. His throat opened. He gasped, sucking in air like a drowning man breaking the surface. For a long moment he didn't move, couldn't move. Then with trembling hands he reached for his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on his exposed abdomen. 3 surgical scars, fresh, pink, perfect, running horizontally across his lower stomach in precise, professional lines. The kind of incisions he'd made himself 1,000 times, but he hadn't made these. No one had. He'd been alone. The chapel door was still locked from the inside. The snow outside was undisturbed. No footprints, no tracks, no evidence that anyone had entered. He pressed his fingers against the scars. They were real, raised, warm, and beneath them, where the constant gnawing pain had lived for months, nothing. No pain. No pressure. No tumor. His hand found his journal. His pen. He tried to write. The first 3 attempts were illegible scribbles. On the 4th try, he managed 2 words. It happened. Then he vomited onto the chapel floor. Not from sickness, from terror, from the complete destruction of everything he'd built his life upon. Science, logic, reason, reality, all of it, shattered. He sat there until dawn, back against the pew, staring at the altar where Reverend Calloway had knelt and prayed for this exact miracle 70 years ago. When the sun finally rose, painting the chapel in shades of gold and amber, Dr. Richard Brennan made a decision. No one could ever know, no one would ever believe, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget what he could never explain. But he didn't leave. That's the part that haunts me most about Brennan's journal. After everything that happened, after the impossible became undeniable, he stayed in that chapel for 4 more days. Why? The answer is in the pages that follow. Pages he wrote in daylight, when reason should have returned, when he should have run. "I need to understand," he wrote on day 4. I need to know. What did this? How? Science demands explanation. My mind demands it. Even if my body is healed, my intellect is wounded. I cannot leave until I have answers, so he stayed. And he investigated with the same methodical precision he'd applied to every surgery, every diagnosis, every patient he'd ever treated. He measured the scars with medical calipers, documented their exact length, depth, positioning, photographed them from multiple angles. The precision was extraordinary, better than his own work, better than any surgeon he'd ever observed. He searched the chapel inch by inch, looking for trapdoors, hidden passages, any mechanism that could explain what happened. He found nothing but rot and decay. He interviewed himself like a patient, documented his symptoms before and after. The tumor had caused specific, measurable effects: elevated liver enzymes, weight loss, chronic pain, visible swelling. He palpated his abdomen repeatedly. The mass was gone, the swelling gone, the pain completely absent. On day 5, he performed the most damning experiment of all. He took his medical kit and made a small incision on his forearm. 1 inch, precise, controlled. Then he bandaged it and waited, documenting the healing process with clinical detachment. Normal healing. No miracle. Just standard tissue repair. Whatever operated on me, he wrote, chose specifically to heal the tumor. It ignored minor cuts I'd sustained setting up camp. It ignored the chronic arthritis in my left knee. It removed only what was killing me. This was not random. This was intentional. That realization terrified him more than the experience itself. Something intelligent had touched him. Something that understood human anatomy better than he did. Something that made choices. On day 6, he did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He knelt at the altar where Calloway had died. Not to pray. He still couldn't bring himself to call it that. But to ask, to speak into the silence and see if anything answered. "What are you?" he whispered to the empty chapel. "What did you do to me? Why did you do it?" The silence pressed back, heavy, expectant. "I didn't ask for this," he continued, his voice breaking. "I came here to prove you don't exist, to expose fraud, to die with my convictions intact. And you violated everything I believe. Everything I am." His hands were shaking. Tears ran down his face. The first time he'd cried since his diagnosis. "I should be grateful," he choked out. "I'm alive. The tumor is gone. I have years ahead of me now. But all I feel is terror. Because if you're real, if this is real, then everything I've built my life on is a lie." He waited, part of him hoping for an answer, part of him praying for continued silence. What happened next? He documented with almost manic precision. The temperature dropped, 52 to 30 seconds. His breath became visible. The smell of incense returned, stronger now, overwhelming, and then, for the first and only time, he saw them. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. Impressions in the air, like heat shimmer but cold. Shapes that suggested hands, arms, figures. 7 of them surrounding the altar, surrounding him. The whispers returned. Not in his head this time, in the chapel itself, echoing off the walls. "We do not ask belief. We do not require faith. We simply are, as death is, as life is, as mercy is." He prayed for those who would come. Broken and dying, "You came, you were broken, now you are restored. This is answer enough." The shapes faded. The cold retreated. The silence returned. Brennan knelt there for 3 hours, unmoving. When he finally stood, his legs barely held him. He packed his equipment with mechanical efficiency: camera, notebooks, medical supplies. Everything except one item: the letter from Reverend Calloway. He placed it back between the floorboards where he'd found it. For the next person. For the next desperate soul who would come seeking what medicine couldn't provide. As he walked out of St. Helena Chapel for the last time, he turned back once. "Thank you," he whispered. He didn't know who he was thanking: God, Calloway, the shapes, the hands, the impossible thing that had saved his life. It didn't matter. For the first time in 30 years, Dr. Richard Brennan prayed, and something, somewhere, was listening. He drove back to Boston in silence. The scars on his abdomen burned like ice the entire journey. They would burn on and off for the rest of his life. A reminder of the night his certainty died, and something far stranger took its place. Dr. Richard Brennan lived another 44 years. He never published his findings, never spoke publicly about St. Helena Chapel. His colleagues noted the change. The man who'd been sharp, dismissive, contemptuous of anything he couldn't measure, became quieter, more careful with his words. He continued, practicing surgery until 1967. His obituary in the New England Journal of Medicine called him a skilled surgeon with an unusually compassionate bedside manner in his later years. What they didn't know was that he kept 2 photographs in his office desk, never displayed, just there. One was of his family, the other was of 3 surgical scars that should not exist. The journal I hold came from his grandson, a man who found it after his own cancer diagnosis. Stage 4, terminal. He'd read his grandfather's account 7 times before mailing it to me. I don't know if I believe it, his note said, but I'm running out of options, and I need to know if that chapel is still standing. It is. I visited St. Helena Chapel 3 weeks ago. It's more ruined now than in Brennan's time. The bell tower finally collapsed in 2003. The roof is mostly gone. Nature is slowly reclaiming what man abandoned. But the altar still stands, and between the floorboards, I found the letter, exactly where Brennan left it. Reverend Calloway's final prayer, preserved by accident or design for over a century. I also found something else. 13 more letters, different handwriting, different dates. 1947, 1962, 1978, 1995, 2011, all telling the same impossible story, all left for whoever would come next. I don't know if miracles are real. I don't know if what happened to Dr. Brennan can be explained by science we haven't discovered yet, or if it requires faith in something beyond measurement. But I know this. We live in a world that demands proof, evidence, repeatability. We've built cathedrals of concrete certainty and staffed them with high priests of rational thought. And yet, there are still places where the impossible whispers, where desperate souls go when medicine offers only comfort, not cure, where the boundary between what we know and what we cannot explain becomes thin enough to touch. St. Helena Chapel is one of those places. The question isn't whether you believe Dr. Brennan's story. The question is, what would you do if you were dying and someone handed you a map to a place where the impossible became real? Would you go? Or would you die with your convictions intact? Brennan made his choice. 13 others made theirs. As for Brennan's grandson, the man who sent me this journal, I received an email from him last week. 3 words. I'm going tomorrow. I haven't heard from him since. But somewhere in Wyoming, in a chapel that refuses to completely fall, an altar still stands. And between weathered floorboards, 14 letters wait for number 15. The invisible is always there. Just beyond the edge of what we can see, what we can measure, what we dare to believe. Sometimes it reaches back. Sometimes it touches us with hands we cannot see. And sometimes, if we're desperate enough, broken enough, open enough, we let it. Next time, I'll tell you about the nun who was buried alive in 1889 and what they found when they opened her coffin 3 days later. But that's a story that requires daylight to tell. If this story moved you, if it made you question what's possible, share it with someone who needs hope. Subscribe to hear more stories from the forgotten places where faith and the impossible meet. Because these stories, they're not just history, they're happening right now, somewhere.